There is a moment, and most people only get one, where everything you built to protect yourself stops feeling like protection and starts feeling like a prison. Merrick Nixon had lived inside his for years, controlled, deliberate, untouchable by design. And then a woman came into his home, barefoot and soft, and completely unimpressed by any of it, and dismantled the whole thing without even trying. He asked her to stay. He, a man who had never asked for anything he couldn't take, said the words out loud in the dark and meant every single one of them. And she said yes. Not with words, not yet. But she stayed at that window, and she looked at him, and something between them that had been held at careful distance for months finally closed. This is part 3. This is where the walls come all the way down, where he stops managing what he feels and starts showing her, where she stops waiting for it to go wrong and lets herself have something good for once. If you're new here, subscribe before we begin, and drop a like if you've been here since part 1. Tell me in the comments, are you the type who loves the slow burn, or were you screaming at the screen for them to just get together already? Either way, let's go. She called the agency on Saturday morning and told them she was no longer available. It was a 30-second conversation. She hung up, set her phone face down on the bathroom counter, and looked at her reflection for a long moment. Not with doubt, exactly, but with the particular seriousness of a woman who has just made a decision she intends to honor. Then she washed her face, put on her favorite sweater, and went to make coffee. Merrick was already in the kitchen. He looked up when she walked in, and she could see him reading her the way he always did. That quiet assessment, except now it carried something warmer underneath it, something that didn't bother concealing itself anymore. I called them, she said. He didn't ask what she'd said. He could see it in her face. He simply crossed the kitchen, took her face in both hands with a gentleness that still startled her coming from him, and kissed her. Unhurried, certain. Good morning, in the most complete sense of the word. When he pulled back, she was smiling despite herself, which she suspected had been at least partially the intention. Coffee, he said, like nothing seismic had just occurred, and turned back to the counter. You're very calm about this, she said. I'm extremely calm about this. That's annoying. I know. But she could see the line of his shoulders. The particular set of them that she had learned meant he was containing something, and this time what he was containing looked a great deal like relief. The weekend passed in a new key entirely, not dramatically different on the surface. Lena still demanded pancakes. Gerald the giraffe still required a seat at the table. The apartment still held its particular rhythm of noise and quiet. But the space between Veda and Merrick had changed its quality completely. He touched her now without the architecture of plausible deniability. A hand at the small of her back when he moved past her in the kitchen. His fingers finding hers briefly on the counter and not immediately retreating. Small things, deliberate things, the physical language of a man who had decided and was no longer interested in pretending otherwise. Veda felt herself adjusting to it the way you adjust to warmth after a long cold. Gratefully, carefully, with a residual instinct to brace for it to be taken away. That instinct was hers to manage, and she knew it. He couldn't fix what her ex had broken. What he could do, what he was doing in his particular undemonstrative way, was simply show up consistently enough that the bracing started to feel unnecessary. Sunday evening, after Lena was in bed, they sat together on the couch for the first time. Actually together, his arm around her, her legs tucked up beside her, the city dark and glittering beyond the windows. It was ordinary in a way that felt extraordinary. He was reading something on his phone, She had her book, and at some point she realized she had read the same paragraph 4 times because she was more interested in the warmth of him beside her than anything on the page. He reached over without looking up and turned her book right side up. She hadn't noticed she'd been holding it upside down for the last 10 minutes. "Don't say anything," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said, and she could hear the smile in it without seeing his face. She leaned into him slightly, and his arm tightened around her slightly, and it was so simple and so right that it almost hurt. Monday arrived with the particular energy of a thing that needed to be addressed. Merrick came to breakfast already in his suit, already composed, and waited until Lena had finished eating and wandered off with Gerald before he set his coffee down and looked at Veda with the expression she had come to recognize as his "I have something to say and I've already decided how" face. "I need to make a change to your employment arrangement," he said. Veda went still, not with fear exactly, but with the particular alertness of a woman whose history had taught her that sentences beginning that way rarely ended well. She kept her expression neutral and waited. "I'm terminating your contract," he said. The words landed clean and clear. Veda blinked. Something cold moved through her chest before he continued. "And I'd like to hire Gloria's niece, who has been looking for a nannying position for 3 months, to take over Lena's care." He picked up his coffee, held her gaze steadily. "Which means you would no longer be my employee." The cold thing in her chest dissolved so quickly, she almost felt dizzy from the reversal. She stared at him. "You're firing me," she said slowly, "so that you can date me. I'm restructuring an arrangement that has become a conflict of interest." That is the most Merrick Nixon sentence you have ever said. It's also accurate. She laughed, a real one, sudden and unguarded, the kind that surprised her coming out. He watched her laugh with an expression that was unambiguously fond, which on his face still looked slightly like a man discovering a new muscle he hadn't known he had. "What about Lena?" Veda asked when she'd composed herself. "She adores you. That doesn't change. You'd still be here, still be part of her life, just differently." "Differently," she repeated. "As what exactly?" He looked at her steadily. "As mine," he said, simply, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Veda looked at this man, this controlled, complicated, cedar-scented man who sat on floors and saved her name as a warning, and stood outside her door in the dark, and had just formally fired her in order to be with her properly, and felt something in her chest open up so completely that it almost frightened her. Almost. "You could have just asked me to dinner," she said. "I'm asking you to dinner," he said. "Tonight. Somewhere that isn't this kitchen." "I like this kitchen." "I know. We're going anyway." She bit the inside of her cheek to keep the smile from taking over her entire face, with limited success. Later that morning, Merrick made 2 phone calls, one to Gloria's niece, who accepted with immediate enthusiasm, and one to a restaurant on the Upper West Side, where the maitre d' knew his name and his preferences, and asked no unnecessary questions. He stood at his office window afterward and looked out over the December city, and felt something he hadn't felt in so long that it took him a moment to identify it correctly. It was uncomplicated happiness, small and certain and entirely unfamiliar. He didn't reach for his phone to check the contact named Don't. There was no longer any reason to. The restaurant was the kind of place that didn't need to announce itself. No sign above the door, just a number and a handle and a warmth that hit you the moment you stepped inside. Candlelight, low music, the smell of something extraordinary happening in a kitchen that knew exactly what it was doing. Veda had worn a dress she hadn't worn since before everything fell apart with her ex. Deep green, simple, the kind that required nothing from her except to exist in it. She had stood in front of her mirror for a moment before leaving, and thought, with some surprise, that she looked like someone who was doing all right. Merrick had looked at her when she came out of her room, really looked, the full, unguarded version, and said nothing for a moment. Then, "You look beautiful." Not a line, not performance, just a fact, delivered quietly, the way he delivered everything that mattered. She had felt it in her spine. The maitre d' greeted him by name and seated them at a corner table that offered privacy without isolation. And Veda noticed the small ways the room adjusted to Merrick's presence, not with fanfare, but with a quiet deference that spoke to the kind of man he was in the world outside their apartment. She had known it abstractly, sitting across from him in candlelight, watching a room full of people unconsciously orient toward him. She felt the full weight of it for the first time. It should have been intimidating. Instead, it made something possessive and warm move through her that she chose not to examine too closely. They ordered, they talked, and the conversation was different from their sitting room evenings in a way that was hard to define, more deliberate perhaps, or simply freed from the particular restraint of a space where they had both been performing careful versions of themselves for months. He told her about his father. Not everything. She understood instinctively that everything was a long way off. But something real, offered plainly, the way you offer something real when you've decided a person is worth the risk. His father had been a man who demonstrated love through presence and never through words. And Merrick had spent 40 years deciding which of those things actually mattered. Words, Veda said. Presence, he said, at exactly the same moment. They looked at each other. Both, they said, simultaneously. He smiled, the full one, the one that changed his face completely, and she decided then and there that making Merrick Nixon smile like that was going to become one of her primary occupations. After dinner, he walked her through the cold December streets instead of taking the car, which she suspected was not an accident. The city at night in winter had a particular quality, quieter, more intimate, the cold pressing people closer together. His hand found hers on the second block and held it with a warmth that had nothing tentative about it. They walked without destination for 20 minutes, talking about nothing important and everything comfortable. And at some point, Veda realized she was leaning slightly into his side as they walked, and that he had adjusted his pace to match hers so seamlessly she hadn't noticed it happening. On the corner 2 blocks from home, he stopped walking, turned to face her, and kissed her in the street, with the December wind moving around them, and the city doing what it always did. Indifferent, beautiful, relentless. His hands were at her face again. She had decided she loved his hands at her face. When they parted, she was warm despite the cold, and he was looking at her with something so open, it made her chest ache in the best possible way. "Come home," he said. It wasn't a question. She said yes. Not with words, with the way she looked at him, steady and certain, and entirely without the careful reserve that had defined the first months of everything between them. They walked the last 2 blocks close together, his hand at the small of her back, the city quiet around them in the way it gets late on a weeknight in December, when the cold has finally convinced most people to stay inside. The elevator ride up was 43 floors of a particular kind of anticipation, not nervous, not uncertain, just warm and inevitable. The feeling of something that had been building for long enough that arriving at it felt less like a leap and more like finally exhaling. Gloria had been with Lena. She gathered her things with the discreet efficiency of a woman who understood the situation completely and had no intention of commenting on it, said goodnight with a small smile that she directed at no one in particular, and was gone. The apartment was quiet and low-lit and entirely theirs. Merrick helped Veda out of her coat the way he did everything, without announcement, just present and deliberate, and hung it beside his own. And that small domestic detail, their coats side by side, hit her somewhere unexpected. He turned and found her already watching him, and something in the air between them shifted into a register they hadn't inhabited before. He crossed to her slowly, giving her every opportunity to reset the temperature of the evening if she needed to. But she didn't move back. She tilted her chin up and met him, and his hands found her waist, and then her face, and then her hair, with a thoroughness that made it clear he had been thinking about this for considerably longer than tonight. The kiss was deeper than the one on the street, unhurried and consuming, and Veda felt the last residue of self-protection she'd been carrying dissolve in a way that should have frightened her, and instead felt like relief. He kissed her jaw, her temple, the particular spot below her ear that made her breath catch audibly, which seemed to satisfy something in him, because he stayed there a moment longer with deliberate attention. She had her hands in the front of his shirt, not pulling, just holding, anchoring herself to something real, while the room did what rooms do in moments like this. "I've been wanting to do this for months," he said against her hair. Low, honest, with none of the controlled distance that had defined him for so long. "I know," she said. "I watched you want to." He pulled back enough to look at her. And I wanted you to," she said simply. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the particular look of a man receiving something he had not allowed himself to fully expect. He kissed her again, slower this time, and walked her back toward the hallway with a patience that had heat underneath it. And Veda thought distantly that she had spent so long bracing for things to go wrong that she had forgotten what it felt like when something went exactly, completely, undeniably right. His bedroom was dark except for the city light coming through the windows, that particular Manhattan glow that made everything look like it existed slightly outside of ordinary time. He stopped at the threshold and looked at her one more time, not asking permission exactly, but giving her the moment, the way he always gave her the moment. She reached up and loosened his tie herself. That was answer enough. What happened between them that night was not complicated. That was the thing Veda would think about afterward, how completely uncomplicated it felt, which was not something she had expected from a man like Merrick Nixon, who complicated everything by nature. But in that room, with the city glowing through the windows, and his hands moving with the same focused deliberateness he brought to everything that mattered to him, there was no performance, no distance, no architecture of control. Just him, just her. Just the accumulated weight of every almost and every held-back moment, finally given permission to exist without apology. He was unhurried in a way that felt like a statement, like a man who had spent months restraining himself and had absolutely no intention of rushing, now that restraint was no longer required. He learned her the way he learned everything, carefully, thoroughly, with complete attention. And Veda, who had braced herself without realizing it for the specific disappointment of reality failing to match the build-up, found instead that reality was considerably more devastating than anything she had imagined in the careful privacy of her own thoughts. She told him once, quietly, what she liked. He didn't need to be told again. Afterward, they lay in the dark, with the city below them, and the sheets warm, and her head against his chest, his hand moving slowly through her hair, with an absent-mindedness that felt more intimate than anything that had come before it. His heartbeat was steady under her cheek. She had expected some version of him to return, the composed, managed version, the one that kept everything at measured distance. Instead, he stayed exactly as he was, present, unhurried, his thumb tracing slow patterns at her shoulder, like he had nowhere else to be, and no interest in pretending otherwise. "You're not what I expected," she said eventually, into the quiet. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Less of this?" She felt him consider that. Less of what, specifically? This. She pressed her palm flat against his chest briefly. The staying. The being here. He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not good at most things people expect from this," he said, honest, without apology. "I work too much. I don't explain myself easily. My world is complicated in ways I can't always share." "I know that. I'm telling you anyway, because you should know what you're getting." She lifted her head and looked at him in the low light. This man who had saved her name as a warning and fired her to be with her properly, and kissed her in the December street, and been, underneath all the marble and control, consistently and quietly, the most present person in any room she shared with him. "I'm not asking you to be simple," she said. "I'm just asking you to be honest." "I can do that." "Then we're fine," she said. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she had spent months learning, the one that lived just below the surface of his composure, the one that was only ever visible in the dark, in the quiet, in the moments he stopped performing certainty long enough to simply feel it. He pulled her back down against his chest without a word. His arms settled around her with a completeness that felt like a decision. Outside, the city kept its relentless, indifferent, beautiful rhythm. Inside, something that had been building since October finally rested. 3 weeks after that December night, Lena decided, with the absolute authority of a 4-year-old who had been observing the situation carefully and reached her conclusions, that Veda should sit next to Merrick at the table instead of across from him. She announced this at breakfast on a Tuesday, rearranging the place settings herself, while Gerald the giraffe supervised from his designated chair, and then sat down and looked at both of them with the satisfaction of someone who had solved a problem the adults had been too slow to address. Merrick looked at Veda. Veda looked at Merrick. They moved their seats without a word. Lena nodded approvingly and asked for more orange juice. It was, Veda thought, the most accurate summary of the previous 4 months that anyone could have produced. Life had rearranged itself. Not dramatically. There had been no grand announcement, no formal declaration performed for an audience. What had happened was quieter and more permanent than that. Veda had stayed. Not as an employee, not as a careful professional presence maintaining appropriate distance, but as someone who belonged in the space, who knew which drawer held the extra batteries and which window Lena liked to watch the rain from, and how Merrick took his coffee at 6 a.m. before he was fully composed, and what his face looked like when he was genuinely happy, which was a thing she had decided to be responsible for as often as possible. Gloria had told her, with characteristic directness, that the apartment felt different. Better different, she had clarified, which, from Gloria, was essentially a standing ovation. Dana had cried on the phone, then denied crying, then asked for every detail, and been given a carefully curated selection. Veda's mother had asked if he was good to her. Veda had thought about the coat hung beside hers, the coffee appearing without being requested, the way he always looked at her first when he entered a room. Yes, she'd said. Really good. But it was a Sunday in January, gray outside, warm inside, Lena at a birthday party downstairs, and the apartment belonging entirely to the two of them, when everything that had accumulated between them found its final, clear shape. They were in the kitchen, which was where so much of the real life between them had happened, and Merrick was doing something at the counter, and Veda was sitting on the island, watching him with a contentment so complete it had a physical weight to it. And he turned and found her looking, and didn't look away. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I'm just happy." He set down what was in his hands and came to stand in front of her, which put them almost at eye level with her sitting up on the counter. And he looked at her for a moment with that expression, the unguarded one, the one that was only ever fully visible in the quiet moments when he stopped being Merrick Nixon and was simply the man who sat on floors and knocked on no doors and saved her name as a warning he never once managed to follow. "I changed it," he said. She looked at him. "The contact," he said. "In my phone. I changed it." Her chest did something she no longer tried to name efficiently. "To what?" He held her gaze. "Just your name," he said. "That's all it needed to be." She took his face in her hands, reversing it for once, her palms at his jaw, his eyes on hers, and kissed him the way you kiss someone when you're not in a hurry, and you're not afraid, and you have every reason to believe that this, right here, is exactly where you're supposed to be. He kissed her back the same way. His arms came around her completely. Outside, January did what January does, gray and relentless and not particularly interested in being romantic. Inside, Veda Townsend was exactly where she had never planned to be and could not imagine leaving. And Merrick Nixon, who had built his entire life around controlling outcomes, held her like a man who had finally, willingly, let one thing be completely out of his hands. If this story found you at the right moment, drop your rating in the comments, 1 to 10. Be honest. And if you made it all the way here, from part 1 to the very last word, thank you. Really. It means everything that you stayed.